Hello and welcome to Australia Polity. I'm Leisha Driscoll. Today's the 1st of May, and we're looking at what's really driving the Select Committee hearings, including the social media campaign that preceded them, the various windfall tax proposals, and finish with where this might all head next. My guest today is Michael Barrett. Michael's joining me to dig into the real story behind this Select Committee on gas taxation, particularly the PRRT, and why people keep comparing it to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Hello, Michael. Thanks for joining me. Please tell our listeners a bit about yourself.
Hi, Alicia. Thanks for having me on, and I'm super excited to be here today. Yeah, a little bit of information about my background. I've got a background in manufacturing, international supply chains and logistics. I've worked for guys like Mars, Yamaha, and Wesfarmers. And out of those working experience, that's given me a great understanding of trade policy, how global business actually works. And I guess it also helps that I'm a fanboy of the crazy world of Australian domestic politics.
Great. Michael, I want to start with the viral social media posts. They caused a lot of noise before these hearings and claim the Australian government collects more tax from beer than from gas production. Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly, Alicia. That's where our discussions began with those social media posts. And I guess from my perspective, whilst those posts are fun and they're attention grabbing, I always suspected that once I scratched beneath the surface of those posts, I was going to find that they weren't really comparing apples with apples. So I went back and I rechecked the PRRT legislation and also had a look at the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which, as you say, the PRRT is often compared to. And now that I've done all that, I think I was pretty right in thinking that those social media posts aren't comparing apples with apples. But I've got to say, along the way, I also became a bit alarmed at the level of misunderstanding that's out there. And maybe I'm getting a little bit conspiracy theorist here. Perhaps there's an element of disinformation in these social media discussions. It's just that I can't work out whether this is a deliberate thing or it's just people not bothering to take the time to really understand the history and the development of the PRRT legislation, the problems it was seeking to address, and how it proposed to solve these problems. And look, further to that point on these social media discussions, I mean, having watched the on-camera antics adopted by certain members of the Select Committee at last week's hearing, I'm beginning to find some cynical enjoyment in those committee members' constant comparisons between what they see as the negatives of the PRRT and the positives of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. One of the logical outcomes that follows if the PRRT was reconstituted to look like the Norwegian government sovereign wealth fund would be that all of us Australians, and that includes the Green members of the Select Committee, would become part owners of operational gas leases. Hence the reference in the title of the podcast to be careful of what you wish for.
Oh man, that's so funny. The sweet irony that fossil fuel Greens members on that committee would end up part owners of operating a gas lease. How does that even work? Michael, tell us about the history.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, the historical background to the Petroleum Rent Resources Tax, or the PRRT, that goes all the way back to the late 60s when it was clear to everyone that Australia was on the verge of a multi-generational boom in the exploration and production of minerals, petroleum, and gas. And the Australian government wanted to make sure that Australians got their fair share of the ongoing taxation revenue from this boom. But they also needed to encourage companies to begin exploring for the petroleum and gas reserves. And two Australian economists of the time, Anthony Clunies Ross and Ross Garnaut, and interestingly enough, Ross Garnaut is still around today and he's working in the renewables sector. But they've been looking at ways in which the Australian federal government could implement a taxation system that could address these requirements, but also take into account the various state government-based royalty taxation schemes, which were already collecting royalties from earlier minerals, oil and gas production sites in
Wow.
places like the Victoria Bass Strait. So by the late 1970s, Clunies, Ross and Garnaut proposed a resources rent tax, which would only be levied on the annual net positive cash flow of a project. And I'm going to repeat that phrase again because that's the key to the PRRT puzzle. The
Mm.
tax is levied on the annual net positive cash flow of a project.
Oh, okay. I just need to interrupt you there a bit. I'm actually a bit of a Philistine, Michael, and I have to ask, what what's the difference? I don't know the difference. Please, can you explain to me and the other listeners what the difference is, please?
Alicia, I'm so glad you interrupted me because that is a key question. It's a really important thing to ask about. And it takes a long time to get your head around what that phrase actually means. So I'm going to try and explain it this way. So gross revenue is the total amount you get for selling your goods and services. Net revenue is the amount you have after you deduct all of your selling expenses. And in
Oh,
this case, we're talking about exploration and production costs, wages, borrowing costs,
okay.
asset depreciation, all of these sorts of things. Now, the taxation on the net positive cash flow means that taxation is only payable when the gross revenue figure minus the net revenue amount is a positive figure.
Okay.
If it's a negative or a loss cash flow figure, and that is possible, no tax is payable. So during a typical life cycle of an oil and gas project, there are many years where the project is actually cash flow negative.
Okay.
Therefore, under the PRRT, no tax is collected, even though if you look at it on the surface, the gross revenue is telling you that sales are being made, and this is actually still the basis on which taxation is collected under the PRRT.
Okay.
But I think this moment, this sort of proposal by Clooney's, Ross and Garno, it was probably the high watermark for the PRRT because, as we now know, the PRRT discussion has descended into what's basically a 40-year never-ending squabble between the federal and state governments, industry lobby groups over things like the territorial boundaries for taxation purposes, who gets the rights of access to the ongoing share of PRRT taxation. Of course, that's when it's actually being collected, and what should be acceptable deductions for calculating net revenue. And this current select committee is, I think, the fourth formal attempt at
Hmm.
reforming the PRRT. And
Okay.
that's not counting other formal attempts or media campaigns over the years. And I just want to close out this by saying, and I'm not only saying this because I'm a fanboy of Australian politics, but I think that the ALP has always struggled with the PRRT because it puts them right up against their arch nemesis, the very powerful mining, petroleum, and gas
Ah,
producers business lobby.
okay.
And right from the start, the PRRT proposal faced open hostility from these industry lobby groups, and that helps explain why it took from the late 1970s until 1987 for the PRRT legislation to be finally passed by the Australian Federal Parliament. And probably the best illustration of the power of these lobby groups was a very aggressive media campaign that was run against the Rudd and Gillard Labor governments between 2010 and 2012
Mm.
in their attempts to introduce what was called a resource super profits tax, which eventually became a thing called the Minerals Resource Rent Tax. And then that was immediately repealed by the incoming Liberals National Coalition government. So I reckon a lot of ALP people are still suffering PTSD over the media campaign run by these business lobbies.
Sounds about right. How then does our current PRRT compare with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund scheme? And did our government get the PRRT any closer to the Norwegian one over those last three changes?
Yeah, Alicia, look, to answer your second question first, I would say probably not. We're not that
Uh,
much closer to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. But to answer your first question, I think I need to explain to people what is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and put it
Absolutely.
into a framework that everybody will understand. So
Thank you.
No worries. So look, there's two supporting parts to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. One's called the Norwegian Petroleum Act of 1996, and the other one's called the Norwegian Oil Fund. But as I say, I'm going to try and consolidate and reframe all of this in a way that the listeners will easily understand. So if we can imagine it this way, Alicia, you're a property developer and
Okay.
I'm the Norwegian government, and you come to me and you say, Michael, I'm looking to build 10 apartments over the next few years, and I hear you've got some land available. And I say, great, Alicia, I do actually have some blocks of land available. And
Hmm.
guess what? I'm also a property developer. So, how about this for a deal? I'll give you all of the approvals required to lease out my land for 50 years on a 50-50 partnership basis. And I can see from your application form that you think that each of your 10 apartments will cost about 1 million to build. And you think that once you've built them, each of them will be valued at $2 million.
Mm.
But instead of selling them once you've completed them, you're going to rent them out and you think you'll get about $100,000 per annum. So here's the next
Okay.
part of our deal.
Okay.
You have to pay me, you have to pay me 22% royalty on the rent amount. But because I understand that rents can go up and down over time, and I don't want you to lose money on this deal, I'm going to come to you each year with an adjusted rent figure. And just between you and me, that figure's likely to be $80,000 per annum. So your 22% tax is going to be paid on the $80,000, not the $100,000.
Okay.
And I also understand that apartments are expensive to build, and you might decide that you're not going to build all 10 apartments at once. So again, I want you to succeed. But although you have to pay me 56% taxation on the apartments,
Hmm.
that taxation rate is going to be on the net price of 1 million, not the gross price of 2 million. And to
Okay.
help you even further, you can decide to average that 56% tax over an extended period. So, for example, it's okay with me if you pay nothing in 1 year, 56% the next, 112% the next, back to zero the next year after.
Okay.
It's entirely up to and look, a couple of other things I forgot to mention. You don't have to pay me for my 50% of the lease. It's free. And one final thing I want
Wow.
you to think about is that yeah, the total 78% taxation that you pay to me goes to the Norwegian government pension fund, and where Norway has built the world's best social welfare system for its citizens. But it's also got the implied advantage that anyone who challenges us in court on our little lease deal,
Mm-hmm.
like those green activist groups, for instance, they lose the support of Norwegian people because they don't want anything to impact on their world's best social welfare. So, Leisha, if all of that sounds good, if you just sign the paperwork that I'm about to send to you, you're good to go. So,
Nice.
yeah, very nice indeed. Very nice indeed. So, my thoughts are that even at that combined 78% taxation rate, it's going to be hard for you not to make money on that deal. But more importantly, it brings us back to the title of the podcast that if you follow the Greens' logic and reshape the PRRT to look like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, you're going to end up with all of us, including the Greens, owning a share of an operating gas lease.
I love it. Well said. Now, I want to change direction. The current push for windfall taxes. Over the past few months, there's been calls for a straight 25% levy on LNG export revenue, ideas for reforming, replacing the PRRT. Last week saw a shift. In media interviews on Thursday and Friday, Prime Minister Albanese appeared to harden his position against any major new tax. He pointed out that the gas industry paid around $22 billion in taxes last financial year. He also said some public debate has distorted some of the facts. And that was said in response to the claim that Australians pay more tax on beer than on gas exports. But beyond domestic politics, there seems more weight on international politics during this global fuel shortage. Government is currently focused on securing reliable fuel supplies, including from Malaysia, South Korea, and Japan. And these countries have repeatedly made it clear they oppose any windfall tax that could raise prices, disrupt contracts. There also appears to be mixed support for a big new tax inside Albanese's own cabinet. So, given all that, Michael, how realistic is it to introduce a significant windfall levy right now?
Yeah, look, another great question, Alicia. And I think off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what is the definition of a windfall? I mean, is it a higher price than is currently the gas is currently being sold at, or is it a lower price? And what metrics do you use to calculate a
Yeah,
windfall price?
sure.
And I guess the producers are also going to ask, well, is the windfall tax payable on the long-term contract price or the spot market price? Because they're two very, very different pricing structures. But I think more importantly, what the PRRT has taught us over the years is that prior to any proposal for any windfall tax or even a reconstituted PRRT, being introduced to Parliament, agreement must be reached between the federal and state governments about when and where any new taxes are collected, who collects it, and who's
Mm,
entitled to a share of that tax. Because otherwise, I fear we're headed back into another 40-year period of intergovernment squabbling over any new
mm,
taxes on the gas
yeah.
sector. And
Yeah.
also, exactly. And look, I think another impediment, and this is sort of going back to the days of Clooney's Ross and Garneau in the 70s, is I think that over the last 40 years, we've seen a decline in the overall ability of the Australian bureaucracy to come up with innovative and forward-looking taxation solutions in this area.
Mm,
I mean, Australia's bureaucrats now seem content to act as a regulator or an enforcer of existing legislation rather than an innovator of creative legislative solutions on behalf of all Australians. Cool.
Thanks, Michael. So, looking ahead, with the Senate Select Committee due to report very soon, the 7th of May, and the federal budget dropping on the 12th of May, where should we go from here on gas taxation?
Yeah, Lisa, look, I think overall the PRRT's time has passed. I mean, those
Yeah.
easy wins from exploiting the original petroleum and gas fields from the 60s and 70s have been achieved.
Mm,
And if you look at the case of gas, it's now evolved onto a different product. It's now an LNG supply chain. So it's going to be nearly impossible to re-engineer the PRRT to become something like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or to create a windfall tax in the PRRT structure. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the world's moved on as well. I mean,
mhm.
countries like some of the African nations and South American nations, and of course, let's not forget Russia sitting in the background. They weren't producing in the 60s and 70s, but now they're now producing LNG gas as cheaply or perhaps more cheaply than Australia. So the competitive landscape is really fierce now, and Australia runs the risk of being progressively swapped out for other countries as a supplier of energy. And I think further to that point of being swapped out, I think the parlous state of Australian politics plays into this. I mean, Senator Pocock using last week's select committee hearings to ask the CEO of Shell to tell him what is the export sale price of their LNG gas. I mean, this looks like someone that's playing more for social media likes rather than an Australian parliamentarian. Because anyone with even a basic knowledge of commercial contracts knows that pricing details are commercial in confidence and divulging them in public will result in a legal action against you.
Yeah.
And you could also argue that disclosing the contract price would also be a national security issue for Australia's foreign trading partners, as it would identify the feedstock price for one of their key ingredients in their industrial processes. So, in particular, the Japanese, I don't think would be very happy about this. So I think all of these elements are feeding into this growing perception of Australia as an unstable trading partner. And I think introducing new taxes, or look at introducing new taxes, feeds into this growing perception. And it probably isn't in Australia's long-term interests either. But I think if you really want to look for new sources of taxation, the mining of critical minerals is probably going to be a better place to start.
Well said. What stands out to me is how difficult it is to design a resource tax that captures a fair share for Australians without damaging the investment we need or upsetting our key trading partners. It's clear the PRRT was built for a different era before LNG exports became so dominant. Turning it into something closer to the Norwegian model might sound appealing, but as discussed, it has unexpected consequences, including that ironic possibility that I love that many of the loudest voices calling for change could end up as indirect part owners in those gas leases. So right now, the Albanese government seems to be prioritising Australia's reputation as a reliable energy supplier, especially while navigating a tight global fuel supply and diplomatic relationships with Japan and Korea. But time will tell if that position holds after the budget and the committee's final report. As Michael said earlier, be careful what you wish for, folks, especially when it comes to the PRRT. All that glitters certainly isn't gold. Quite the cautionary tale. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to Australian Polity and share the episode with anyone interested in how Australian politics and energy actually work. I'm Leisha Driscoll. Until next time.